Neurological Disorders Lesson 5.5, When Does Abuse Become Addiction? The goal of this lesson is to get students thinking about the bigger picture of drug abuse and addiction. At the end of this lesson, students should be able to distinguish between drug abuse and addiction, describe the social, psychological, and biological risk and protective factors for drug addiction, and describe the neuromechanism behind the biological risk and protective factors. We'll achieve our goals through a Socratic discussion and either a card sort or a card game. To prepare for this lesson, you'll need to review the key scientific concepts presented in it. They include drug abuse versus drug addiction. That abuse is defined as the overuse of a drug by an individual, whereas drug addiction is the continued compulsive use of drugs despite adverse health and social consequences. This lesson also describes risk and protective factors for drug addiction, including those that are social, psychological, and biological. You can review this scientific content in the background reading provided to you in the teacher primer, the teacher manual, and the student workbook. The teacher primer provides in-depth knowledge about the scientific content. The teacher manual or lesson plan provides a minute-by-minute explanation of lesson structure, including instructions on how to manage the discussion and activity, and the student workbook provides additional explanations for your students. You also need to be sure to print the risk and protective factor card sets and the homework worksheet for your students. The key point of the lessons do now is that people begin using drugs for a variety of reasons, including to feel pleasure, improve self-image, peer pressure, self-medicate, relieve stress, and curiosity. We'll get to this key point with a peer-to-peer discussion. In the do now, students work with a partner to brainstorm reasons why they think people start abusing drugs. You'll discuss this do now within the lesson's discussion. The key points of the first discussion are the reasons that people begin using drugs and the difference between drug abuse and addiction. That abuse is the overuse of a drug by an individual, whereas addiction is the continued compulsive use of drugs despite adverse health and social consequences. We'll get to these key points with a Socratic discussion. The discussion starts by reviewing the do now with the students. After discussing the reasons students came up with during the do now of why people started abusing drugs, you'll use this slide to present the list of reasons compiled by the National Institutes of Mental Health from their research on drug abuse. The next slide asks the students, when does abuse become addiction? This slide is animated so you can lead your students to the idea that drug abuse and addiction are on a spectrum, and a drug user is likely not aware of when he or she is passing through the different stages. In addition to transitioning to more serious forms of use, drug users can also transition backwards from addiction to abuse, although this is less likely without intervention. The key difference between abuse and addiction is that drug addiction relates to a person's control over drug use. Once a person is addicted, they lack control and continue using the drug despite it harming them. The key point of the activity is that everyone has a different set of risk and protective factors for drug addiction, and those include factors that are social, psychological, and biological. We'll get to this key point with either a card sort or a card game. To discuss the risk and protective factors involved in addiction, this lesson uses a game, Risk, the game of life domination. The game aims to point out that it really can be a collection of risk factors that could lead someone to becoming addicted to a drug. That said, drug addiction is a very serious issue, and if you feel that your students will find the game to not be serious enough for the topic at hand, please use the cards in the game as a starting point for a discussion and skip having the students actually play the game. If the students are not playing the game, they can use the cards to simply sort those that they think are risk from protective factors. If you are having your students use the game, use slide 6 to review the rules of the game before letting them play. Have the students play a couple of rounds of the game to stress that with each situation, the collection of risk and protective factors can and will be different. The key point of the second half of this discussion is again that everyone has a different set of risk and protective factors for drug addiction, including those that are social, psychological, and biological. We'll get to these key points with a Socratic discussion. After the students have finished the activity, the next set of PowerPoint slides allows you to facilitate a discussion about the factors that appear on the cards. The factors are either protective or risk factors for addiction, and they fall into two main categories from there, those that are social and psychological, and those that are genetic and biological. You'll first have the students sort the cards into two piles, those that are social or psychological, and those that are genetic or biological. After having the students sort them in this way, you'll have them sort each of those piles into two piles. One pile for factors that would protect you from addiction, and one pile for factors that would put you at risk for addiction. You'll first review the factors that are social and psychological. While there is certainly a lot to elaborate on within this list of social and psychological risk and protective factors, our focus is on the biology of addiction, so this part of the discussion is brief, but certainly can be expanded if you like. Next, you'll elaborate on each of the genetic and biological risk and protective factors. Each of these factors has its own set of slides to help explain why each is either considered a risk or a protective factor, and each set of slides is set up in the same way. You first present the factor. For example, you have a family history of addiction, and ask the students, is this a risk or a protective factor? And then elaborate on the next slide. Here, having a family history of addiction is a risk factor, whereas not having a family history of addiction is considered a protective factor. Then next, you naturally release more dopamine in the synapse than the average person. Releasing more dopamine is a risk factor, because releasing more means that there is more dopamine in the synapse to increase activation and have greater dopamine signaling, and that leads to greater addiction potential. Then, you have more dopamine receptors than the average person. This is also a risk factor because more dopamine receptors means that there is increased dopamine signaling, and that again means that there is greater addiction potential. You are taking a prescription drug that blocks dopamine receptors. This is a protective factor because if a drug is blocking dopamine receptors, that would decrease dopamine signaling, thus decreasing addiction potential. You are taking a drug that blocks dopamine transporters. Specifically for cocaine, which acts in this way, this would be a protective factor, because if a drug is already blocking dopamine transporters, there is nowhere for cocaine to act, and thus there is a decreased addiction potential. The key point of the wrap-up is that everyone has a different set of biological risk and protective factors for drug addiction. We'll get to this key point with a reflection and discussion. In the wrap-up, the class reviews the biological and genetic risk factors. It's interesting to note that most of us don't actually know which of the two factors we have. For example, most of us don't know how many dopamine receptors we have compared to the average person, or how much dopamine we release. So while we can be aware of some of our own risk and protective factors, we likely don't know our own complete set. The key point of the homework is that motivation is a key factor in determining whether someone will become addicted to a drug. We'll get to this key point with a homework worksheet. The worksheet includes a reading and questions about drug use by soldiers during the Vietnam War. This has become a classic case study in drug addiction because it demonstrates how motivation, or the reason behind drug use, drastically changes people's addiction potential and their potential to quit. Students often ask for more details about the risk and protective factors. You can find more in the teacher primer, the teacher manual, and the student workbook. One of the most common questions teachers get is, why do some people become addicted to drugs while others don't? This lesson is trying to address that exact question with a discussion of risk and protective factors, and we'll elaborate on it more in tomorrow's lesson that discusses the role of motivation in addiction. Basically, our vulnerability to addiction differs from person to person, and there are many risk factors that can influence the likelihood of someone becoming addicted and the probability that they will achieve abstinence. At the end of this lesson, students should appreciate that we all have a different set of risk and protective factors when it comes to addiction, and that for several of the biological factors, we might never know where we stand. This lesson provides biological context and explanation for the risk factors underlying addiction, and also links biological variations in synaptic signaling to variations in behavior. Don't forget, if you have any questions, concerns, or feedback, to let us know. You can contact any of the CTSE team members, and we'd be more than happy to help you.